You know what is my most difficult passage in the Bible, my friend in seminary said to me? The one I hate the most, actually, is this passage from Paul, from the 5th chapter, where he talks about suffering producing endurance, and endurance producing character, and character producing hope. Balderdash, she said. Actually, she didn't say balderdash, she said something else, but this is going out on the World Wide Web, and so it was balderdash. She said, what does this makes God into some kind of abusive parent that makes people suffer, that kills off fathers, that makes people get horrible diseases, that have family conflicts and all manner of things, war and pestilence and all of that, all so that we can suffer and then endure and then build character and then finally have hope. If this is what the Christian faith is about, I want nothing to do with it, she said. And then she said, I think we need to go talk to Professor Johnson about this. And I wanted to say, what do you mean, we? Professor Johnson was a new professor at Yale Divinity School when I was a first-year student and my friend was a first-year student. He taught New Testament. He had been a Roman Catholic, he'd been headed for the Roman Catholic priesthood, but in the middle of seminary realized that he really did not have a call to ministry in that way. And he certainly did not have a call to celibacy. So he left the seminary, and a few years later, but he went on and got his PhD, and a few years later he met and married a woman by the name of Joy. Great name. And now he was at Yale Divinity School, untenured first professor. And he was about to be accosted by not one, but 2 Yale Divinity School women students. This was a long time ago. We were very feisty at that point. And so my friend said, yes, we need to go talk to Professor Johnson, because he's the one who's teaching New Testament. And we're going to get to this letter to the Romans soon enough, and he needs to tell us what he thinks about it. So I said, sure. We called him up, we made an arrangement, and we went in to see Professor Johnson. He greeted us very cordially. He was a very gracious person, and invited us to sit down. And then he said, how can I help? And my friend said, you can explain this passage from the 5th chapter of the book of Romans. What the heck does it mean? Since when is suffering a good thing? Because it produces endurance, and that produces character, and that produces hope. Why don't we just get to hope first? My friend said. I mean, what do you think about this passage, Professor Johnson? Does God cause suffering? Now, just a bit of backstory. Professor Johnson's wife, a few years into their marriage, had been diagnosed with a very, very odd and very debilitating disease that was slowly taking her life. It was somewhat akin to ALS, but it hit people who were in their 20s and 30s, not in their 50s or 60s. And so Professor Johnson didn't answer our question immediately. Instead, he just sort of let it sit there. Does God cause suffering? And finally, he sat up in his chair. He flipped to that place in Romans. He read that passage aloud, the one that Duncan read in Spanish and Bruce read in English, and said, that's not what Paul's saying. That's not what Paul's saying. He is not saying that God causes suffering in order to make us stronger, to make us more hopeful, to make us more trusting. What kind of God is that? And who are we who would trust such a God? That's not what Paul is saying. He said to both of us, "You know by this time, at least I hope you know, because we've read the book of Acts and we've read some of the other letters, that by the time Paul wrote these lines, he had suffered greatly. He'd been imprisoned. He'd been arrested. He'd been flogged. He'd been shipwrecked more than once. And now he's in a Roman prison, waiting for what happens next. And he knows only too well that his friends, his fellow church members, people he's given his life for, whether they live in Rome or Philippi or Galatia or any place else, are living under that same shadow of empire that he's living. And that their fate, torture, death, all of those things, is quite likely the fate awaiting him. Do you think, he said to us, do you think that Paul, who is such an educated person, such a profound person, would give 1 minute of his time to worship, much less advocate for, a God like that? A God who'd caused all of that. Think for yourselves, young women, he said. What do you think? My friend and I just sat there, didn't know what to say. And then Professor Johnson went on to say, "That is not a God I can believe in. How could I possibly believe in such a God who would cause such suffering to the one person I love most in this world?" So finally, my friend, in a very small little voice, said, "Well, what does it mean then? What does it mean?" Professor Johnson waited a while longer, took a deep breath and said, "It means, at least for me, what Paul would say later on in that same letter. That there is nothing in life or death, things that are nor things that are to come, powers or principality, nothing in all creation, not even suffering to the bone, that can separate us from God's love." That's what I think it means. Not that God causes suffering, but that suffering is simply the hand we get dealt as human beings. And if, like Paul, you stand up for justice, you stand up for love, you stand up for life, this world may well do to you the same things it did to Jesus Christ, who did all that as well. That's what it means. That no matter how or what the suffering is, God is still going to be with you. And that's what helps you endure. And that's what builds your character. And that is what fills your heart with hope and with love. Just like he said. My friend and I sat in silence for a while longer. And finally we simply said to Professor Johnson, "Thank you. Thank you." To which he said, "Anytime." And we left. Now, I said at the beginning of before I introduced the scripture, that in my life I did not know my father. For all intents and purposes, I didn't have a father, other than biologically. But I guarantee you, in that moment, with Professor Johnson, interpreting Paul the Apostle, I had two fathers. Because both Paul, in his long ago words, and Professor Johnson, that day in his office, gave life. And what else does a parent do? Or somebody who's in the stead of a parent do? But give life. Give life. Paul is sometimes called the father of our faith, or a father in the faith. And yes, it's because he was determined to get this new Christian church thing off the ground. But I think even more deeply, because he helps us understand the power of this faith. That it's worth giving your life to. And that it is life-giving. And so this Father's Day, my friends, I invite you to think about who are the life givers in your own life. And maybe it was your own biological or adoptive father or grandfather, but maybe it was a teacher, a coach, a choir director, a pastor, a rabbi, a family friend, someone, whether for you over the course of your whole lifetime or just for, as I said, a semester, or maybe even just a passing encounter, gave you life. Gave you life. Someone who gave that life also out of their own suffering, perhaps, their own endurance, and their own God-given hope in you and in this world. Who were those people for you? Can we remember them this day and give thanks? I'd like to add 2 people to your list. I mentioned George Rivera and Steve Lawrence. You may not know them, but they have been fathering young people in this wider community of Santa Fe for a good long time. And if you come next Friday to the Hoop Dancers, you'll for sure meet Steve and possibly George. George Rivera and his wife had several children, one of whom was a young boy by the name of Valentino Rivera, or Lightning Boy as he was known. A few weeks ago at Michael McCabe's service, Mr. Rivera, who was the former governor of the Poake Pueblo and also a wonderful sculptor of huge monumental sculptures, you'll see some up at all around Santa Fe, including up at the Native American Museum on the hill. He and I had a chance to talk about sort of his life and also his son. He said that Valentino came out of the womb dancing. In fact, even before he came out of the womb, he was dancing. And he just couldn't sit still. He just loved to dance. And when he was about 2 or 3 years old, his parents took him to a hoop dance where the lead hoop dancer was a young man by the name of Nakota Lawrence, who was internationally known. Danced at the Heard Museum, danced at the United Nations, danced all around this world. And Valentino said to his parents, "That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do." And so they started getting him lessons to hoop dance. And he quickly became one of the best-known hoop dancers at age 5 in this whole state of New Mexico and indeed around the world. He also went to the United Nations. He also went to the Heard Museum. He had something in him. That's why he was called Lightning Boy. He was like the lightning because he was so swift and so powerful and so amazing, like a bolt of lightning. Danced all over. But when he was 7 years old, in a car with his father, another car ran into them. And although the father survived that accident, Lightning Boy Valentino ended up in the hospital with a broken spine and broken bones all throughout his body. And for the next almost full year, he had surgery after surgery after surgery, and he never gave up. He told his parents, I want to do whatever I have to do to start dancing again. But Valentino never made it out of the hospital. He died when he was 8 years old. And in his honor and in his memory, his parents founded Lightning Boy Hoop Dancers, so that other 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 20-year-olds could learn the sacred, healing hoop dance. Suffering. It's not what God wills, but sometimes by the grace of God, it can help us endure the most horrific things we might face. And by the grace of God, that endurance might build character. And by the grace of God, that might build hope. So that even if you can't bring a son or a daughter or a child back to life, you can commit to giving life to others. I think that qualifies one as a father, mother, or parent. A year and a half after Valentino's, Lightning Boy's, death, the young man who had so inspired him, Nakota Lawrence, who had gone on to keep dancing and had also worked with the Lightning Boy troupe to teach younger dancers this sacred art. He was out hiking up in northern New Mexico, trying to scale a bridge, and he fell and died instantly. His father, Steve Lawrence, like George Rivera, has committed his life to teaching other children how to dance. Those of you who were here last year for the Hoop Dancers met Steve because he was the narrator for the event. Like George, a parent who faced the worst thing that can possibly happen to any parent, no matter the age of the child. But somehow, by the grace of God, has endured. And out of that has taken that horrific experience and committed himself to life and to the lives of young people once again. Who qualifies in this world or in our own lives as fathers or mothers or parents? Those people who give life. And maybe it is biologically out of a womb, or maybe it is by siring a child. But I think it's much more those people who out of their own suffering and sadness and hurt to the bone connect with life again for the sake of the lives of others. So maybe we don't call it Father's Day or we don't call it Mother's Day. We simply call it Life Giver's Day. Because that, for me at least, in my own life and I know in the lives of others, is what qualifies one to have that title of father, mother, parent, life giver. And not just for one's own children, but for all God's children. That's what Paul is talking about, I think. That's what he's saying to those early Christians. No, not that God causes suffering, but in the midst of that suffering, we are not alone. In the midst of such suffering, we still know that the God of life somehow walks with us in the face of all that death to new life. That's what helps us endure. That's what builds character. And my friends, that is what gives hope, overflowing into our hearts as Paul in prison cell wrote, as George in a hospital room knew, as Steve mourning his child knows to the very, very marrow of his bones. Who are the life givers in your life? And how, no matter what your age, no matter what your gender, no matter who you are, will God empower you to be a life giver to others? That's our call. That's what it means to hope. Thanks be to God. Amen.